The hospital. The city was founded on a shallow plateau rising above a valley between two large distant mountain peaks. Water flowed from these mountains clean and clear, and slowly, over eons, had carved out river valleys around the rocky plateau. Occasionally, when rainy weather came, water could come rushing down these mountains and flood the rivers, isolating for a time the plateau. It was only natural that people settled on the grassy plateau. There were plenty of rocks there for building materials, fertile land for fruit trees, date palms, grapes, wheat, and barley. The area was also naturally fortified, for the rivers had carved out natural walls around the plateau, above which even simple battlements of a few feet looked impressive. From the earliest days there were always two types of people that settled around and on the plateau. There were the herdsmen and the fishermen. These people could not have been more different. Yet they lived side by side on the plateau, sharing a common language, common religious beliefs, enjoyed the same festivals, and often intermarried with the opposite profession. Yet the one profession led men down, the other up. The herdsmen did not envy the fishermen especially. Yes, their work was more arduous, for they climbed with their herds ever higher as the spring turned into summer. Good grazing pastures were all over the sides of the distant mountains, and when they left the city in the spring, their herds would be small and thin. But when they returned in autumn, the goats and sheep would be fat, much more numerous, for they would calve in the spring and raise their offsprings on the green mountain slopes. The herdsmen enjoyed heavenly views, cool mountain breezes, even in the heat of summer, and fresh meat, milk, and cheeses they would make and send down to the city from time to time. Their diet was supplemented with berries and wild fruits and herbs they could find from time to time. They also became excellent archers, shooting down wild birds and frightening off wolves and other predators that endangered their wealth. The fishermen often thought that they were envied by the herdsmen, for they had easy walks down the river banks. They would erect elaborate fences in the rivers, trapping larger fish, mostly a type of catfish that grew fat in the deeper waters. They would only be gone a few days, perhaps a week at most, then return to the city with baskets of fish, as well as game they would catch with their fishing spears. Wild pigs were, for example, that loved the muddy banks and isolated pools of the river. It's easy for us to see why the lifestyles of the herdsmen would keep them in excellent health, perhaps as easy as it is for us to see why the fishermen may have been plagued from time to time. There were no sewer systems for the city, nor water treatment facilities. Human waste often went directly into the river. Catfish, being bottom feeders, would accumulate pollutants in their bodies, as would pigs. While the herdsmen would return tanned, lean, and healthy, the fishermen would occasionally bring back into the city plagues of parasites, or dirty water which would lead to cholera or other similar diseases. The herdsmen also, being removed from the city, would be unlikely to catch these contagions. Illness and disease were always lurking in the shadows of urban life in ancient times. This city was no exception. Every 100 years or so, terrific flood would come, and even flood parts of the plateau where the city dwellers resided. Whenever this would happen, all the residents would flee to the highest point, a little rocky outcrop that jutted just above the plateau, also providing in quieter times quite a beautiful view of the valley and the distant mountain peaks on either horizon. It was natural for the people to build permanent shelters on this outcrop, for it often took weeks for the terrible floods to recede completely, and shelter is one of the most basic needs for people. Soon one of these shelters became dedicated to the god these people worshipped. This building expanded as the city prospered. This site, being the place of comfort and refuge in times of need, became associated by people as a place of comfort. People began to flee there in times of illness now, too, not only a refuge for floodwaters, but a refuge for all sorts of human maladies. As the sick and infirm fled there, so did caretakers, healers, herbalists, medicine men, witch doctors, and the like. It was only natural for a hospital, or sorts, primitive though it may have been, that came into being. As the city prospered, learning and science naturally developed. The leaders of the city, having excess wealth to spend at times, invested in ways to prevent the occasional outbreak of contagious diseases, as they too were not immune from these outbreaks. Young children saw the prestige that successful healers enjoyed, some with opulent lifestyles provided by wealthy benefactors. More and more, medicine became a profession of the skilled and elite, and less myth and superstition. Successful techniques and recipes were passed down and compiled, and soon a school of sorts developed next to the original building of healing. The original building was eventually expanded, as was the school, and soon a recognizable hospital was born. In only a couple of hundred years since the founding of the city, since the first records and inventories began to be compiled at least, the science of learning what we would know as medicine came into being in the city. During this generation, a great healer and leader of the school appeared. For convenience sake, we'll call him Hippocrates. For like Hippocrates, he developed a creed to do no harm, which would be memorized and recited by all students at the school. He organized the curricula with techniques and recipes for remedies being compiled into organized units, and taught in formal classroom settings, with practical applications of these techniques being practiced by elder students, while younger ones would watch from a sort of gallery. The gallery afforded a view into the hospital building and was connected to the school. Hippocrates also developed a sort of a logo for the school, a stone replica of which was placed atop the roof of the hospital. The logo consisted of two intersecting lines forming an X, which symbolized the two paths of the primary industries of the city, the fishermen who went down to the muddy waters, and the herdsmen who climbed into the green peaks of summer pastures. The X would forever represent medicine for these people after Hippocrates. For many generations after Hippocrates, some new techniques and developments occurred, but mostly there was a kind of stagnation. Hippocrates was a hero to these people, and the students that followed his students were reluctant to challenge his assumptions. His word became a kind of a law. But within just a few generations, another genius appeared in the city. His name, for the sake of convenience, we will call Galen. For like the real Galen, he developed medicine into a nearly modern state of efficiency. He understood the importance of sterility, cleanliness, especially when undergoing surgery, and insisted on boiling water and instruments in the hospital. He separated patients into different wards to prevent contagious diseases from spreading within the hospital. He developed a type of hypodermic needle to successfully remove cataracts, and started a process of research whereby results of failed experiments would not just be discarded, but further studied to understand why they had failed and what may have gone right in the midst of the failure. Galen was indeed a genius, but there were those in the school, even amongst his colleagues, who resented his questioning of Hippocrates' methods and techniques. A conservative school appeared that rejected any difference Galen might have had with the elder Hippocrates, and sought to restore Hippocrates' teachings to prominence, not just a footnote along a path of continued development. To make matters worse, once Galen had passed away, his own students began to look upon his own teachings and techniques as a kind of gospel. They emulated his walk, copied what he wore, even adopted a type of bracelet he wore as a type of curing magical talisman. These two conservative schools, each seeking to copy their leader in every detail, prevented medicine from developing further, and worse, they even began to forget some of the developments each of their founding fathers had taught. Completely forgotten in just one generation was Galen's methodology, his science of learning. His followers were experts on what he wore, how he walked and gestured, and they memorized even casual conversations he had had, those that were written down, that is, in vain efforts to emulate his curing ability. Yet disease began to spread once again. People began to lose their faith in medicine as an institution. In just a few generations, all progress had been lost. Herbalists and other primitive superstitions competed often successfully with the hospital in curing their patients. The hilltop of the plateau once again became an unruly mob of the aged, injured, and ailing. Perhaps it was the surge of hormones in adolescence that saved the town. For some reason, a time came when the youth began to question the authority of the elders, the teachers, and the institutions they stood to inherit. The meddling question that so bedeviled parents, why, began to be echoed again and again by this generation. It was not that they disrespected the elders exactly, but they just wanted to know the truth. It was the truth that they sought, and the truth they would gain in the end. This generation sought out old, moldy manuscripts from the library of the old school, dusted off their covers, and enthusiastically copied them again and again. Why was their mantra? This was also the question their teachers just could not answer. They had learned to do things simply because the elders had taught thus and thus. They grew skeptical and resentful, but when shown the truth, they understood the good that would come out of it all. The young generation had discovered Galen's methodology, his questioning of tradition, his challenging of old techniques. If it was true, it would be repeatable. If it was repeatable, it could be understood. If it failed, it still could be repeated, but with slight changes, and still some understanding could come out of it. The hospital was becoming resurrected. The cure rate began to surpass the herbalists and magicians. Money started to come to the hospital again. It received a fresh coat of plaster and shone bright white like a beacon of hope to the city. The leader of this young challenging generation, a great doctor named John, soon spoke openly about a new age that was soon to dawn on this young city. He saw the results that his students were getting with the new methodology. He understood the development and process that had created Hippocrates and Galen. He knew that another young genius was bound to appear, for the city was growing wealthier, more numerous, and all the best families sent their most intelligent sons to his school. He knew all of this pointed to a new age about to be born. This young Jesus we'll call Jesse, and his teachings would revolutionize medicine, even reaching down through the ages to our own day. As a young man barely into his adolescence, he corrected boldly his teachers at the school, showing he knew the teachings of Hippocrates, Galen, and the few geniuses that had written down contributions since then, backwards and forwards. People at the time thought that he'd been born with this knowledge, for his understanding of the human body and the effects of disease and injuries were as innate as coughing or sneezing is to you and I. He developed medicine as we know it. He changed things so fundamentally. The city started a whole new calendar, dating it not just since the founding of the city, but since when Jesse had been born. Dr. Jesse assigned medicine into three categories: the mind, the blood, and injury. These three categories were listed in Chapter 6 of the first book the students were to study. All these would have to be understood together, taught as a whole, not separately, if one was going to be able to really help those in need. The mind was understood by simply talking to patients, calming them, and through these conversations not only was the patient soothed to a degree, but much was learned about the possible brain injury, blood loss, previous occurrence of the symptoms, and even possible causes of the malady. These conversations, when studied, could lead to prevention of injury, like teaching the populace how to make a better ladder, or petition the king for laws regulating building construction, or boiling water before drinking it, or checking fish for worms before eating or selling. Dr. Jesse knew there was something about the blood that could lead to greater understanding of diseases, so he frequently sampled blood of patients. He changed Galen's hypodermic from merely treating cataracts to removing small amounts of blood for experimentation and study. His blood school would eventually experiment with injecting drugs and vaccines. His students grew to understand the connection between the heart and blood. The circulatory system began to be understood. For injury, the earliest thing was prevention, but understanding of human anatomy was paramount for treating even basic injuries. Dr. Jesse exposed the whole body to his students to study. They started on small animals, fish and frogs, and eventually dissected whole pigs and goats. They began to operate efficiently, crossing broken bones and even dental surgery, correcting broken bones. He established 3 tiers of study: students, apprentice doctors who would work under senior doctors' supervision, but in emergencies could have the ability and confidence to work unsupervised and not be a danger to the public, and finally the master physicians, who would be required to publish some sort of new development or technique before they could achieve the master's certificate and teach a class of their own. Their research would have to be impeccable, as it would be judged by a panel of master physicians before it could be published. Thus the body and school was a kind of a trinity. He also established once and for all the end of meaningless rituals. He banned the wearing of Galen's healing amulets and posture, dress, and gestures. He continuously ridiculed those that parroted Galen's conversations and sayings, yet had forgotten his methodology, the real contribution of the man. Healing was the business, not imitation of Galen or Hippocrates. The conservative imitators of these men were banned forever from the hospital and the school. Although it is important to note that respect for Galen and Hippocrates was at the root of Jesse's teachings, he knew that these men, as if they were his brothers and had grown up with them, he intuitively understood the conversations the imitators had memorized, understanding the meaning behind the conversations, and trying to get the imitators to understand this as well. His followers, moreover, genuinely respected and even adored the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, as well as the other few geniuses that had written down legacies at the school. Yet all this was taught in a progression of understanding, not just taught as rote lessons of static thought. The xenophobic imitators of Galen and Hippocrates joined forces and formed a small, seldom successful practice, a kind of a clinic really, in a distant corner of the city. And their legacy continued, sad to say, a kind of living legacy of stubbornness and lack of clarity of thought. Truth, after all, was not their goal, just meaningless repetition of rituals they genuinely thought had caused cures. Their lack of success and popularity did not deter them. The hospital prospered and expanded. Soon it had established little offshoots, clinics we would call them, endeavoring to reach every single citizen of the city, not only to cure their maladies and injuries, but to teach them principles of good health. Life expectancy lengthened, prosperity shone on the people, wealth abounded for all. Generation after generation passed, each with their leaders and developments. All the wisdom accumulated into great volumes and was thoroughly studied and improved upon. Students did not just learn, but key to their learning was understanding that age-old question, why? The hospital expanded again and again. The teachings and study went far beyond the borders of the old city. 5 centers of learning now constituted the hospital, each of the 5 an impressive edifice, with an equally impressive school and library attached. The central one, was, of course, in the old city, on the little outcrop of rock, where so many had sought refuge so many generations ago. The other 4 were in neighboring towns on either side of the mountains, where the herdsmen still steered their sheep and goats. Each of the 5 had dozens of little clinics they oversaw, some reaching out into different language areas, helping the ancient enemies of the old original city. Continuous exchange of students and communication by traveling doctors kept all 5 in step with the latest developments and techniques. Yet there are things which medicine cannot solve. Politics and natural disasters from time to time separated the schools from one another. Yet within a few years, perhaps a generation at most, they were back in communication and harmony was restored in their teachings. Until one day, completely unexpectedly, one of the 2 mountains erupted. The volcano was tremendously destructive. The lava overflow dammed up the little river, and the old city was flooded like never before. The school and hospital was on an island in a lake now, with the mass of the populace having fled, or having died in the conflagration that followed the incendiary ashfall. Contagious disease spread like never before amongst the population, for their food sources were destroyed, fresh water was scarce, and travel was nearly impossible. The best doctors of that age died caring for the sick, for they could not, in good conscience, eat and rest as they needed to, when so many were in need. Their libraries were largely destroyed. Yet 4 of the 5 schools remained in contact with each other. Their libraries were largely intact, although many of their number also succumbed to the diseases that spread from fleeing refugees. Medicine languished for a time as the population sought out more basic needs: fresh water, reliable food sources, safety, security. Not many families had children to spare to send to schools, let alone money to donate. The schools themselves had to set aside important learning time for growing harvests for themselves, herding their own animals, even studying how to raise fish in ponds. The wisdom of the elders did not pass efficiently from the elders to the new students as it once had. When people grow desperate, they are often driven to do dire things, and such was the case for these people. Crime was rampant, and the schools were often targets of theft, even murder. This was the beginning of a real dark age. Still, 4 of the original schools managed to survive, yet it was many generations that passed before these 4 learned that the original school had survived. People had remained in the area of the ancient city, and once the lava plug had eroded from the continuous river flow, the waters receded, and the old city began to be habitable once again. One day the elders at the hospital were astonished to see visitors that were learned in the arts of medicine. They spoke a different language, a dialect, actually, that they soon deciphered to allow basic communication. They were astonished to find that the ancient arts had been preserved intact. They had no idea that the other 4 schools had survived the cataclysm. They had indeed thought, for such was the evidence available to them, that all the world had been destroyed. Civilization still existed just over the horizon all this time, yet the waters of the lake had separated them from this fact. Once the waters receded, the old trails and roads were passable again. Communication began to be restored. Yet harmony eluded them. The original school had stayed faithful to the teachings that they had preserved. They had forgotten or lost all of the developments of the blood science. They understood that it was listed with the other 2 disciplines in chapter 6 of the first book, but they just did not feel it was important enough to enforce. It was more of an elective the students could choose if they wished. They would not require it, nor try to convince an unwilling patient of its benefits. The other 4 schools were astonished at this, for this was their founding school, the heart of their history. But such was the state of things. The first school, the original hospital, could not abide being taught, as if it was an underling, by the 4 colonial schools, what was right and necessary. The original school, though, now teaching something slightly different than its founders, actually sent doctors to establish competing clinics in the boundaries of the colonial 4 schools, trying to win over potential students. The competition between these 2 sides, forming eventually 2 separate schools, although closely tied by history and privately admired and respected by followers of each, caused confusion in the population as to which was real, which was truth. The one school, the original, said that a whole third of the discipline was optional, while the other side, having more consistent teachings with the original unified school, often publicly bickered with the doctors and clinics of the original school. To make matters worse, the imitators of Galen and Hippocrates, now just called imitators, began expanding clinics of their own, teaching to the public that theirs was the original school, from which both of these competing schools owed their existence. The fact that this was indeed true to some extent made debate difficult in the public arena. Herbalists and magicians, never wholly ousted from the colonial areas of the hospital, also started to make a comeback, as people could more easily understand their methods, for formal education was grossly lacking during this time period. Whenever education is lacking, a whole people suffers. It's only a matter of time before leaders emerge in the population that suffer the same ignorance as the followers. Just as ink once spilled into water cannot be prevented from reaching every portion of the vessel, ignorance spreads through a population when formal education wanes. The hospital itself, both in the original school and the 4 colonial schools, soon grew weak with impotent administrators, lack of funding, and fewer bright students. Soon leaders of both lungs of the hospital were corrupt and seeking only their own wealth and comforts. Bright and idealistic students were few and far between in those days. Those that were bright and idealistic grew frustrated with the corruption they saw in the administration of the hospital. The same vigor that once saved medicine for these people now started to erode it further. The students now were not interested in why, but now, why not? They said to themselves, why not just create their own schools, their own hospitals, their own methods? It started with one promising young doctor named Martin. Dr. Martin saw the corruption around him and decided that the whole system was sick. Why should master physicians rule the school? Were not everyone just as capable as they, at least potentially? If the masters were corrupt, the whole system should be rotten. He endeavored to put a check into place to counter the rule of the masters. The students should be able to vote and oust corrupt masters and elect the best masters, the best teachers, to positions of responsibility. Dr. Martin sought democratic principles as the answer to corruption. How could this be wrong, he thought. But he was wrong. Medicine cannot be governed as a popularity contest. Dr. Martin was ousted from the hospital. He was astonished to learn that he was not just ousted by the original school, which he attended and sought to teach at, but the other 4 colonial schools also turned their backs on him as well, honoring the decisions of the masters of the original school. He sought to create his own school and hospital, and soon found that he was tremendously popular. Many political leaders, especially in outlying areas, were envious of the prestige and wealth of the hospital. They were tired of the hospital sending master physicians into their courts and directing what they must do for the good of the people. There was just no effective counter to their influence, even in these darkened times when competing voices were heard on the streets and corruption existed openly within the schools. Still, the hospital was the best at curing people and preventing disease, and most of the people knew this. Yet here was a doctor from their system with the original text written by Dr. Jesse himself, willing to start the hospital and school that they could control, politically at least. They would have an effective counter to the costly demands often given them by hospital physicians. Dr. Martin was desperate and alone after all. He could be controlled. So Dr. Martin started a competing hospital in appearance identical to the original, and, as far as the public could tell, identical in teaching. Some good was done by these physicians after all, as they had the same original text. But Dr. Martin, especially his followers, neglected to include centuries of accumulated wisdom and neglected to teach effectively the importance of continuity, so important even to Galen, and understood by the imitator school, although not practiced by it. So in time Dr. Martin's hospital was doomed to the same fate as the imitator school. It soon languished into repetitious ritual and rote teaching. They taught, after all, that only Dr. Jesse and his predecessors were worthy of study. Everyone that had come since then was just speaking with the same authority as each student. So the most basic guess research, or no, by each student, was as worthy of study as any subsequent master physician. After all, were not these the same master physicians, the same ones who had been so corrupted by Dr. Martin's day? By this reasoning they taught to their pupils every single master physician was equally corrupt. But they neglected to show their students evidence of the lack of worth of these centuries of learning. Eventually the followers of Dr. Martin themselves thought privately that medicine was just not really a science as much as a benevolent belief system. They would try to help, but illness and disease was a fact of life. They started to elect even the sick and ailing into positions of responsibility, themselves being entrusted to teach students how to heal, when they themselves were ailing before them. The whole system became, just as the original master physicians had foreseen, even through their corrupted eyes, a popularity contest, not a science. In time, irrational beliefs became accepted in Dr. Martin's hospitals. The doctors there began to teach that only doctors present could help a patient. That is, no doctor who was not immediately visible could offer advice on a patient's condition. This ended a long practice in the true hospital, shared by the original hospital complex and the 4 main centers still practicing the ancient wisdom, whereby a doctor who was not present, say at a nearby clinic, could be summoned by a messenger or runner with a detailed note of a patient's condition. If the doctor was not able to come, he could send his advice back with the runner. Dr. Martin's hospital taught that only doctors present could help a patient, and that any idea that someone not visible could not possibly help in any meaningful way. This limited the ability of the doctors to help by restricting their ability to only those patients visible in the immediate vicinity. This also restricted the doctor from being able to teach, as his teachings became irrelevant once he passed on, as his words could not benefit a patient he could not see. Only the original teachings of Dr. Jesse and a handful of others from that time could be taught. It was not uncommon, therefore, that in time doctors who cared for their patients in Dr. Martin's clinics and hospitals sent their patients with referrals to the original hospital complexes. As a result of the shrinking teaching materials available to Dr. Martin's hospitals, many practices long taught and developed by the original hospitals fell into disuse. Patients visiting Dr. Martin's hospitals often asked about vacant rooms and sections, once used for surgery or testing of blood, but now empty. Dr. Martin, like the original hospital, had turned away from blood testing and research, having split from the original hospital after the volcano and the decision in the isolated original hospital complex to abandon this section of the original research and development. Complex surgery was abandoned by Dr. Martin's doctors because of another bizarre development in the new hospital, the belief that the patient's thoughts alone cured, not the medicine per se. Dr. Martin had learned about the placebo effect, and so doubted the ability of medicines to really do anything above that of the patient's belief in the medicine to cure. Therefore, attending to the patient's attitudes was paramount. Research into new medicines was merely a tertiary curiosity, not a preferred expenditure of time and effort. As medicines fell into disuse, so did the more complex techniques of surgery. For if a patient's condition worsened, it was due to their lack of faith, not any real physiological condition. Surgery could not help if the belief was not there. So vast wards were empty and unused in Dr. Martin's hospitals. The whole institution became a kind of health club, using herbal drinks and some basic medicines, but in a visible way, seemingly technical and advanced, but purely on appearance for show. The whole institution became in time a pantomime, a play-acting hospital, more like a television show set, more than a technical institution focused on learning and science of curing maladies and injury. So the followers of Dr. Martin grew fewer with each passing generation. They protested this loss of popularity by trying to appeal to the people's sense of political fairness. Is it right, they cried to the people in town squares, that this hospital appoints only doctors who are published researchers to positions of responsibility? Can you allow a system that excludes the infirm and injured from its hallowed hallways of power to grow more popular? But the Dark Ages were ending, and the people were starting to understand truth once again. In a way, Dr. Martin had sown the seeds of his own destruction himself. He had made public the teachings of Dr. Jesse. In his endeavor to open the hospital to the light of democracy, he exposed truth for what it is. Truth. It did not happen overnight, nor in the next few generations. It took a couple of hundreds of years, but the passage of time shone light in the truth, just as Galen and Dr. Jesse had wished. The original hospital, now in the midst of a huge metropolis, was enormous. It was one of the largest buildings of its kind in the world. It had grown so large purely through gifts of those that had been cured, those that had understood best what it really was, hope for all, light in the darkness, truth. As people became more and more educated, more and more of them started to understand that there was more to medicine than just the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates and Dr. Jesse. Medicine was the whole progression of slow learning, more and more of what was true. Everything written in the book taught by Dr. Martin was truth, but there was so much more. People had taken the truth of Dr. Jesse and applied it to so many different situations, in so many different times, in different languages, civilizations, met so many different challenges, that it made the followers of Dr. Martin's heads spin. Those few who sought to understand why their followers were flocking to the original hospital and leaving their humble clinics and opening up the books of the teachings of the master physicians, or better yet, attending a school of the hospital. The rift between the original hospital and the 4 colonial hospitals has not yet to this date been satisfactorily mended. All 5 branches recognize the validity of the other's teaching and history. Yet the original hospital still refuses to require the practice of one of the primary 3 disciplines from its followers. And as successful as it has been in its mission, it would be even more so were it to re-embrace the truth of its founding physicians. Yet the distance between these 5 hospitals and the followers of Dr. Martin are so great, and the challenges in the modern age are so important, that a kind of a gravity is at work, slowly meshing these 5 institutions back together. Communication has been restored for centuries now, and understanding is growing as the rift between those who seek the high road, difficult and beautiful, and those who seek the easy road, plagued with punishments, grow wider. Hippocrates' X has been tilted somewhat by the passage of time, but its truth still speaks volumes to those who take the time to notice.